All right, so welcome everybody to our session on Gnosticism and narrative with Jason Mehmel. Jason is a writer, producer, and director living in Calgary. He's the artistic director for Sage Theatre, and his directing work includes A Year of Magical Thinking, Legislating Love, King Kirby, A Beautiful View. And I've seen most of those, I think. And I've been out 5 or 6 times, and it's fantastic stuff. He's also a speaker, curator, and coach for the TEDxYYC event, and has produced and directed short films and writes comic books, including the anthology book Fight Comics, which I also own, and it's good. Or at least I own one of them. Is there more than one?
Yes. I'll get into.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I own one. Why don't I have more? What are you doing to fix that?
Delivering them.
Okay. Jason discovered Gnosticism through a friend using the Nag Hammadi Codex as inspiration for Dungeons and Dragons, which seems like a perfect encapsulation of his approach and connection to Gnosis. He's continuously exploring mysticism and how it intersects with art. Take it away, Jason. I should also note that Jason has, I think we've discovered now that Jason has officially been a parishioner for 14 years. With our local group. So he constantly lights fires under my arse. And there you go.
Great. Okay, well, here we go. I will share my screen. Can everyone see this?
Yep.
Great. Okay. And where's the... I'm sorry for you guys to have to watch me figure that out. Okay, great. And
it's Linux. We forgive you.
Oh, hush. And now I've lost my paper. Bear with me. Oh, for Pete's sake. There we go. All right. So, Gnosticism and narrative. So the central premise. The narrative process is a Gnostic process. And something to state at the beginning, this isn't an academic paper, this is a report from the field of a storyteller and a Gnostic. Even this presentation is a narrative event, an arrangement of details with a structured order of presentation. Although I'm tying in a lot of interesting theories, I'm also playing fast and loose with most of them, and the metaphors get fairly knotted up. I look forward to any questions and criticisms from my community to refine these ideas. Please click here to accept these terms and conditions. Personal narrative, prelude. Raised in a theology-light religious experience, I had a cultural understanding of Christianity and religion, but not a personal one. Without impugning the church I grew up in, I'll simply say that the focus was never on the deep questions or difficult answers that we find in the rest of the practice. I knew the reasons I was given about why these stories were important, but they didn't really penetrate into my interests. My early church life was mostly about reading a book of Bible stories as a kid and looking forward to the cookies and squares after the service. My secular time, which was the majority, was spent in comic books, novels, movies, video games, something I share with nearly everyone in my demographic. Okay, so the narrative process is a Gnostic process. What is a Gnostic process? At one point, I asked His Eminence to define Gnosticism without referring to history or theology as frameworks beforehand. What he told me was anamnesis, memory, recall. The experience of gnosis is a deep remembering of a connection you have always had. What usually follows is the subsequent question, why don't I remember this all the time? What's blocking me from that? I'm using this conception of connection with something greater as my framework for a Gnostic experience. Gnosis is, of course, not limited to this one type of experience. It's just the one I'm focusing on today. It's also worth noting that a Gnostic event could be regarded as a spectrum of experiences that can also vary in intensity. So what is a narrative process? A sequence of events or connections presented, receiving that with a reaction based on the order and content of the sequence as it relates to what we're talking about. Then experiencing a moment of aha, wherein the sequence connects you to a larger experience than your normal day-to-day, a relation to the world around you outside solely of the narrator or the audience. And these narratives are not exclusively fictional. And in fact, any context or bit of information you can imagine is fundamentally narrative in the way I'm using the term, in that it is constructed and usually sits in sequence with other bits of information. Interestingly, the word narrative has a Latin background reaching to narus, or Gnarus, meaning to know. So going back again to the personal narrative. Now, recently trained in theater, about 15, 16 years ago, working in a bookstore, I bond with someone who will become one of my best friends through various nerdy subjects: science fiction, fantasy, and Dungeons and Dragons. His major in university was history. Between episodes of Babylon 5, a potent mythic name, he runs a game of D&D for myself and his wife, set in actual history. He decides to explain magic as essentially a hack or cheating of the rules of reality, and that this hack is based on some ancient texts he read about in class, the Nag Hammadi Codex. I should note, my friend is an atheist, although thankfully not a militant one. He continues to use elements of these texts in our game, to the point of having archons test our characters in a series of challenges as we pass through gateways. Absolutely fascinated, I continue to research this subject. I come across Stratford's blog, among others. I come across a recorded lecture where he gives an overview of classical Gnosticism. And again, I am fascinated. What is being described to me as a religious event is something I have personal and direct connection with. The brush of gnosis, the gasp as you recognize that connection. This is something that I recognize as something that happens to me when I'm in the process of creating in my narrative art forms, primarily theater, and also what happens to me when I consume some of those works of art. So there are a lot of interesting ways you can look at classical Gnostic myth, especially as a story about stories. A lot has already been done with "in the beginning was the word," and so I'm going to just point at the richness and ripeness of that initial phrase for more ideas and move on. Also, I have to recall a phrase I heard from Jonathan Stewart, though I'm not sure he coined it, that the ancient Gnostics were performing a kind of fan fiction, actively reinterpreting and hacking the religious mythological narratives around them. I love this because I see historical Gnosticism as basically a literary engagement with that experience of anamnesis in their time frame. Sometimes Sophia, Holy Wisdom, carries the blame of generating all the demiurges and archons through her mistake, but pretty consistently, she's also the one infusing the material world with sparks of the sacred flame. In this way, I could see her as an inspired creator, using the classical meaning of inspire to breathe into. That potent richness of meaning that is latent in everything is due to her work. Compare that to the limiting entities, their hollow creations. It's interesting to me how often these are described as copies or imitations of a higher divine structure, which shows an interesting focus on innovation as a divine quality. It's not just that they're copies, but that they're missing an extra ingredient, a quintessence, a sublime element to make them truly connected, and they're incapable of finding that element on their own. I see a parallel with those narratives that are completely, often blatantly, copies of more successful or resonant work. It's the low-budget movie that lurk below most of the popular choices on Netflix, of characters that are not quite Harry Potter and his friends, going on a castle/wizard school, going to a castle, I'll try that again, going to a castle/wizard school that is not quite as impressive or stirring as Hogwarts. Thankfully, in a world full of information today, I think we have a lot less patience for bad copies. Abandon these hollow, illusory worlds. Just catch up to my paper here. This is also where perhaps the trap of detail can come into play. For a manufactured world to be convincing, even if it's a copy, it has to get very detailed. Narratively, this can either be the trap of getting lost in the statistics and data of our fictional worlds to the exclusion of the actual stories occurring. These are the angry debates about the troop capacity of a Star Destroyer, forgetting that its whole purpose as a spaceship is to inspire dread as our heroes run from it. A few hundred stormtroopers, plus or minus, don't impact what that moment means. But letting yourself get caught and invested in that debate means you've allowed to put the detail to put itself between you and the spark of what's valuable in the story. This is not the same as detail that engages and excites or that contributes to the impact of the story. Knowing that a Star Destroyer is 1,600 meters is a detail that adds to the dread. So too can there be details in the constructed world that themselves provide keys to provide that inspiration. This could be learning the mechanism of how sunflowers turn themselves to follow their namesake in the sky, or knowing the deep history of an art form, such as how ancient Greek theater was a religious event and having these details add a rung to the ladder we use to give us that higher connected view. A lot of esoteric practice is a great example of a high level of detail meant specifically to help us get beyond it. I want to paraphrase Monsignor Scott's own previous conclave talk, since it encapsulates this so well. Quote, "It's so freaking confusing that we can eventually make our brains break so that we can access that simplicity of heart and faith and love that exists." The point here is to consider that the myth of the demiurge or archons constructing a world to trap us, filling it full of things that contribute to the distraction from our true connection. Just consider that. It's also easier to evaluate which Star Destroyer facts are useful and which are not. These fictional narratives and contexts all around us are often full of details that make it much harder to determine which facts are useful in terms of the safety for us. This is something I'm always in the process of determining. Is this a detail that will help me or will take me further away? Now, in general, although world-hating dualism is just one branch of a much larger tree of Gnosticism, the approach makes sense. After that moment of anamnesis, it's easier to look at everything in the world that prevented you from making that connection in the first place. Everything from bills to hunger to the emotional frustrations of everyday life, and seeing it not just as something that prevented you, but seeing them as obstacles placed there to keep you out. That level of dualism at play varies among traditions and Gnostics, but the impulse makes sense. The trap that I see here, in terms of a narrative, is focusing on the obstacles as a direct opposition, and then focusing on that opposition to the exclusion of what lies beyond it. You can start to make a narrative out of only what is being opposed versus what's actually at stake. This is especially seductive because having an opposition creates a special kind of clarity. It makes things easier. You don't have to worry about taking responsibility for enlightenment. You can settle comfortably into an established role of rebel. Personal narrative, chapter 2. Googling Gnosticism Calgary, I come across the AJC and His Eminence's parish. I inquire for more. I'm added to an event newsletter, including a listing of coffee and sometimes a second cup, including a listing of coffee times at the Second Cup in Kensington, a hip market area near downtown Calgary. And one day I join Sean and Lance Hodnott for coffee. What follows is at first a sporadic and then continual habitual attendance to the parish. Although the main concepts of Gnosticism are very compelling to me, the Christian lens is a challenge as I contend with a rebellion against my early church experiences. Not a hyper-rationalist atheism, but a mythological banality draining most of the sacraments and symbols of any transformative aspect. A very patient Sean and a nearly as patient Lance engage with me as I question and debate all of the elements that I'm encountering in the services. I still attend, having at least that much religious habit, but at least in the beginning, I'm mostly there for the dinner chats afterwards. Despite my early lack of personal engagement or excitement with the Christian approach to Gnosticism, I remain impressed by the company of the people within the Apostolic Johannite Church. The warmth and patience of the community, the rigor of their thought, and the clear focus on, above all, providing help and an ear for assistance on the journey, rather than telling me what that journey is supposed to be, all make me feel like this is the best place to explore that brush of Gnosis. Imagine more than a decade of this procession of events. Parish services taken in the United Church, dinners at local diners or shawarma shops. And as the time lapse flickers in front of your eyes, you'll see that I get more and more comfortable with the symbols and sacraments, though that mythological banality still rears itself as a continual challenge. What also blossoms is a deep and abiding friendship with Sean, with Lance, and as the parish grows with Max, Angie, Diana, and more. Okay, so narratives of all types surround us, and the theory of what's happening to us as we consume them is ongoing. There's some theories that our consciousness is defined by the ongoing interaction we have between the idea of ourselves and the world we encounter. Another theory suggests that if we don't have a word or an idea for a thing, we simply can't know it. Orwell ran with this idea as he came up with Newspeak, creating a cautionary tale of a force trying to limit language so as to limit thought. And anyone involved in politics knows how much importance there is on controlling the narrative of an event, never mind the facts of it. All of this is to underline the effect narrative processes have on us. They fascinate us. The etymology of fascinate comes from a Latin word describing a charm, enchantment, or spell that is put on the person who is being fascinated. This seems like a useful way to examine the effect. There we go. To examine the effect. Sorry, I got confused with my slide here. I'll just start that again. The etymology of fascinate comes from a Latin word describing charm, enchantment, or a spell on the person who's being fascinated. This seems like a useful way to examine the effect in both positive and negative direction. My early premise rests on the positive form, that the enchantment of stories, symbols, myths, and other contexts are methods through which we can discover an experience of connection and depth with something greater than ourselves. Even now, even among Gnostics and esoteric practitioners, we often see a liberal usage of quotes from not just myth, but popular culture, movies and books. They are borrowing the magic of enchantment from these earlier stories to help reinforce a point or emphasize an idea. This can have diminishing returns, however. If too much of that mojo is coming from somewhere else and the content being provided is more of a mirror or copy of another content versus having a real spark, it runs the risk of having that mojo remain only with its borrowed sources. And the negative form of this fascination has to be remembered too. That charm or enchantment that captivates you takes you over. The negative form leverages the power to not inspire, but solely convince. Not all narratives and contexts are positive ones. If a narrative is defined by information presented in sequence, then we have to remember that that sequence is often based on a choice of what to leave in and what to leave out. You may not always know the reasons for the choice of what is left out in a narrative. In fact, you are likely to never fully know those choices. These omissions can be critical. Propaganda is the darkest side of narrative, the narrative built to convince you of something you'd probably never agree with in the first place. A system of stories arranged specifically to lead you somewhere else. As it relates to Gnosticism, usually this propaganda boils down to the world is terrible and you might as well trust whoever it is telling you this to protect you from it. The biggest danger of narrative's ability to convince is ultimately that it can turn on the narrator themselves. This is the danger of at any time spent with and engaging with critiquing the stories we say make up our world. Stories of ideology, politics, economics, philosophy. With a training community, you can end up in all areas you build yourself, and you entirely yourself in. An over-focus on demiurges and archons, for example, comes with that omission of that very thing that should lie beyond them, gnosis itself, which is something that they'd probably be happy you forgot. Personal narrative, chapter 3. It's now been 15 years of friendship, community, conversation, and food, all with the soft glow of gnosis suffusing everything, like a bright sun with streaming rays through a cloud, so often used in the stereotype of a spiritual encounter with God in stock photography. Cheesy, but it does work. The parish services and sacraments now provide a deep personal impact and sanctuary. I've continued to work as a theater director and creator primarily, with some other projects including early inroads into comics and filmmaking. The connection I have to Gnosticism in my art has only grown deeper. My way of explaining it generally, bereft of the sublime Gnostic context, is to call it empathy, and that the focus of my work has been to expand the connections possible between us by using empathy as a bridge to bring us all together. My esoteric practice has also matured in the sanctuary of community, both locally and with a greater Johannite community. I've tried to give back in small ways to the community, and often in the process of conversation and presentation. My local parish travelers now know me very well, and I've leaned on them for support during the rough stretches of road. I've tried to do the same for them. I've been lucky to celebrate baptisms and ordinations with our group, and it strikes me that some of these moments are probably similar to what was experienced by members of the church that I grew up in, even before the cookies and squares in the hall afterwards. Now, at this point, it's probably clear that I'm not doing a review of the most Gnostic narratives that are out there. That would be fun, and you'll probably see something like that coming out soon, I think. But it is probably worth touching on some of the more direct narratives. Monsignor Scott already did a great job not just covering Philip K. Dick, but also his relevance to Gnosticism. I don't want to repeat any of that, but I do want to note that Dick's work before his personal divine invasion could already be considered Gnostic both thematically and under my premise of the general narrative process. Reading his work provides a connection that is undeniable. But that later work, it is so defined by his powerful Gnostic experience. So some narrative work is not just latently Gnostic, but also intentionally so, often depending on the depth of the Gnostic impact that person had as it relates to how they craft their story. Monsignor Stratford described Gnosticism as a genre in his book, Living Gnosticism, which I highly recommend. I love this because it also acknowledges the outer edges of this definition are things that become fuzzy, as with the same with any attempt to define a genre. All intentionally Gnostic narratives are going to have elements unique to that story or omissions that differ from the others, but it is still useful to draw a circle around an assortment of texts and say, that's Gnosticism. I'd go one step further and suggest that this isn't just a genre, but a literary theory, a way of approaching all texts. I've kind of been making that case this whole time. Gnostic theory would include asking such questions of any narrative, fiction or non. Is there a moment of deep catharsis that the audience experiences through a person or character in this narrative? Do elements of the story resonate with classical or modern Gnostic narratives? Do the people or characters exhibit a state of knowledge or connection that either subverts or escapes the rules and structures that might constrain them? This last one is often a climactic moment in a lot of stories, where the hero or heroine discovers that the antagonist has been operating on a mistaken assumption this whole time. And as soon as that assumption is proven wrong, victory becomes inevitable. A direct example of this kind of theory at play, this morning I was listening to Hozier's song, Take Me to Church. From its music video to interviews with the musician, it's clear that this song is meant to critique anti-LGBTQ views. And I think it does a good job in that goal. But it's also powerfully affecting to me with Gnostic resonances, particularly referring to Sophia. Lines such, if the heavens did speak, she's the last true mouthpiece. Or, I was born sick, but I love it. Command me to be well. Strike me keenly, and I start to interpret the rest of the lines in a similar fashion. I can apply the matched opposites in the song the same way one engages thunder perfect mind. So as I've been saying, narrative and storytelling is always latently Gnostic because you have the capacity to connect with an experience outside your own, and in that process, see that you are connecting to something bigger and outside. If it's as simple as watching a character share a moment that you can also recall, that is the crack through which a Gnostic moment can occur. And it's important to note that the Gnostic intentions of the storyteller do not matter so much as the Gnostic intentions of the audience. It doesn't matter if Hozier wanted that to be a Gnostic song or not. Roland Barthes had the idea of the death of the author, which he puts forward that the only valid interpretations are the ones the audience makes. The authorial interpretation is possibly useful or informative, but it lacks a final authority on what the text can mean, freeing it from the interpretive tyranny of what the narrator intends. Erich Auerbach takes this a step further, presenting the idea of a narrative tyranny particular to religion, requiring that a singular interpretation of a text as fact is which upon that text's validity rests and demands no other interpretations. From a Gnostic perspective, does this image of tyranny sound familiar? This is where it's important to be careful what we debate about in our stories. When we argue the merits of one movie or another, or if the sequel to a novel was as good as the first one, we must avoid the pull of a narrative tyranny, of any story that demands exactly how we should evaluate it. I think it's also important to note the Gnostic intentions of the audience don't matter either. Depending on the work and the story, it can create an inherent Gnostic moment in the viewer. Without a framework to interpret it, this experience might be as inscrutable to them, or it may continue to pursue other work, or they may continue to pursue other works to find a similar Gnostic moment, assuming that works of a similar type or method have a high chance of repeating the experience. So they visit theaters and wait for the lights to dim. Movie theaters and wait for the lights to dim. They open books by the same or similar authors or read similar stories and hope by that last page they will still be transported. They sit in a movie house holding their breath as the projector fires light against the screen, hoping some of that light reflected in their eyes might go a little further and light something even deeper within, a sacred flame. Epilogue, personal epilogue. I'm sitting in front of a frankly daunting array of professionals and practitioners commiserating digitally because a global pandemic has drastically altered how we commune. The desire to honor this gathering with something of use has led to a mix of anxiety and inspiration, and the alchemy of those two energies synthesizes into the talk I'm giving you all now. In the process of researching and writing this, I recall the earliest moments that I felt the brush of a Gnostic experience. I had directed a play in my last year of high school, The Actor's Nightmare by Christopher Durang, and I was standing in the dark beside the audience risers as they watched the production. There is a brief moment where the protagonist shifts from thinking he's in a dream to actually worrying that his life might be on the line. And in that moment, I could feel the held breath of the audience as they rode this fearful moment with the actor, whose breath was also caught as he lived in that moment. Something took hold in me, and I felt a deeper connection to everyone in that space than I had before the play began. For a moment, we were all inspired together, a connection to a deeper well of experience. The impact of that moment leads me to pursue a life in the theater, a pursuit of similar moments. I could give a different talk about the capacity of theater specifically to provide that connection, but maybe I'll leave that for a potential sequel. Let's just imagine me now, some 15, 16 years ago, rolling various polyhedral dice on a kitchen table with very close friends, just minutes away from hearing about a kind of connection that could somehow synthesize my spiritual and artistic lives and reignite a faith in something beyond, something inexpressible, but that is striving to be expressed, something that wants to experience that reconnection again. Well, that's where I leave you here today. I'm indebted to a few sources as I built this narrative for you all. I already referred to Monsignor Stratford's book, Living Gnosticism, which playfully engages with Gnostic thought and aesthetics in a way that directly inspired and informed me here. I want to point out Dr. Zlatko Ples's conclave talk of the poetics of Gnostic myth, which I also found invaluable. If my freewheeling associations and theories are lacking in any way, the doctor's talk would probably fill those gaps. I also want to acknowledge that my definition of gnosis and the Gnostic experience are relatively vague, and I don't give a lot of detail. All I can say that is I've always felt it best to let the ineffable define itself without my effing it up. With that, I thank you for your time. I would be happy to hear any thoughts, address what questions I can, and steel myself to the critiques I deserve. I had it coming. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I was just going to add that Jason and I did an interview a year ago on the podcast called The Art of Gnosticism on Gnosticism and Art. So you guys might enjoy that.
Okay, yeah, great. Brad, it looks like you have a question.
Yeah, can everybody hear me? I've been having some wonky issues with my audio today. Okay, thank you, Monsignor. So Jason, you said, bring the comments, you've deserved it. I've got a quiver behind me of all sorts of stuff that I want to share, but man, this was awesome. This was awesome for me. I can't speak for anyone on this, but I think I can speak on behalf of most, if not all, and just say this was just an incredible, engaging presentation. And I just want to share, my Gnostic experience that I've been going through has been such an evolving and experiential, dealing that it's so hard for me to explain to folks. But a few days ago, someone asked me, what was my calling and what was my Gnostic experience to date? And I said something that I think resonates with like how you closed your presentation. And I said something along the lines like, I can taste what I'm eating and I love it, but I can't describe it yet fully to everyone else, and when I said that, it like popped off and I was like, oh, I need to go write that down. And I went and snagged my journal. So I just wanted to share that with you because as you closed up, that was just, it resonated. So I just want to say thank you. And I wanted to share that. And I yield my time to the remaining distinguished members of the conclave. Thank you.
That was very gratifying to hear, and happy to hear other questions or critiques. But one thing I did just want to mention is I think exactly that moment of having something that you can't describe, but that you keenly wish to, is, I think, again, something I would say is not just a narrative process, but a Gnostic process, and that I think is why Gnosis can be latent in in every moment of our lives.
Well, I'll go if nobody else has anything. Thank you, Jason. That was your prose is delightful. It was a joy to listen to, and I am very excited about the kind of a more formalized Gnostic media criticism. A kind of light bulb went off when you were talking about it. I'm like, I get it now. Yeah, that is something that needs to happen. Yeah, for sure. So. Very excited. I hope to see it on a YouTube channel near me real soon.
Yeah, that was something I was directly thinking about as I was writing this.
I just wanted to mention a quick thing. Somebody had mentioned, or I think it came out of Brad's comments, that also I think sometimes from a spiritual experience standpoint, outsiders can confuse ineffability with the experience of the lack thereof, that having the experience and being able to talk about the experience are two different things. And onlookers can sometimes make the assumption that because if there's a gap in one, there must be a gap in the other. But in fact, I would argue that the greater experience, the bigger the gap in the second thing, right? Like the harder it is to, that if anything, that, cat got your tongue, is more likely to, I guess, testify, for lack of a better word, to the veracity of the experience than if you can easily sum it up.
Or perhaps God got your tongue. That actually, again, like, so it's so interesting giving this talk today after hearing the talks that came before. I couldn't help but see a lot of what I'd already been writing in relation to that. Like, again, going back to Philip K. Dick, the difficulty of his later work, as engaging and powerful as I find it, but as difficult and weird as Scott described, is like, because, yeah, exactly, like, God got your tongue. It's like, it's this incredibly powerful but difficult thing to process. The act of processing is the wrestling with the angel of the idea is like such a heavy work.
Okay, Christian, you're up.
Yeah, just to go off of just this narrative process, and it got me thinking. Obviously, you were connecting a lot to the hero's journey, right? And it reminded me of the first talk yesterday on millennialism and the quote that he gave by Jordan Peterson about picking up the weight, and I think that's like it seems like that's like a key part in the hero's journey, is being able to pick up that weight. And that is like the moment of gnosis, or the moment where you learn that, like, what you were before, like, in order to beat the bad guy, you have to be able to overcome what you were before and become better than that. And yeah, it was just kind of really interesting to have you like describe this narrative process, and it gave me a lot of clarification on that too. So yeah, thank you. And it was great talk. Thank you.
Oh, much
the hardest
appreciated.
mountain to get over is yourself. in terms of heavy lifting and lifting the weight, at least in my own experience, the hardest mountain to get over is yourself. So I think that lifting, that sense of lifting and self-work. Sorry, I'm doing a lot of interrupting this morning. I'm trying to get in stuff between the dog. But yeah, I'm enjoying this. This is fantastic.
All right, then, Monsignor Rosbach.
Jason, this was an exceptional talk. I really enjoyed it thoroughly. And one of the things I wanted to tease out was at the very end, you mentioned something about gnosis every day or something along those lines. I don't remember exactly the phrase. But what it reminded me of is the idea of praying without ceasing. And with us being Gnostics, that awareness of the narrative, and as you're going through it, as you're experiencing your own personal narrative, which was the frame of your talk, at the gnosis that is what you're doing, is so important. The ability to be able to recognize that not only are you doing, I mean, you're in the middle of your life and you should be living it and you should be doing the things, but to also know that, to know that you're doing it, to know that the choices you make a longer narrative and that they make a coherent whole at a certain point. And I think that is definitely part of the practice of Gnosticism, is that knowing yourself and knowing that your story that you're telling is important, and being the observer as well as the observed at the same time. Does that make any sense?
It makes a ton of sense. It's one of those things, like a much larger idea that I was like, I do not have the research to back this up, or maybe an idea that I'll point to, and maybe either someone else will do, or 5 years from now I'll give a conclave talk about it, is something around like cognitive behavioral therapy, which does focus on a lot of exactly what you're talking about, an awareness of not just your life, an awareness of not just your feelings, but your feelings about those feelings, like your ability to see that you're going through a process, and I think so. A lot of the cognitive behavioral therapy has no spiritual direct connection to it, but I think exactly what you were saying, the ability to live your life, but then also recognize the capacity for gnosis that is latent in any of those moments, is essentially a Gnostic cognitive behavioral process, which I think we could see in a lot of mindfulness training as well.
Just to go off of what he said there just a little bit, that kind of made me think of, in a way, that with keeping a narration, it's kind of like, there's this overall narration, right? And we can maybe view God as the author of that. But for our own individual life, we are the author of that, and we're making our own choices, but it's fitting into this overall much bigger narrative. Yeah, just some thoughts.
Totally. This is also something I've been thinking a lot about too. There are again, things I didn't have time to fully research, but there's branches of narrative therapy and narrative coaching that I think really engage with this idea of that and a lot of literary theory also engages with this idea of texts that are relating to other texts. And so then there's the story that you are the author of, or at least that you are in more direct control over. And then there's the stories of the world around you and the other people around you. And these are essentially like interacting and interrelated texts that are always under a constant state of revision. I think like all I can really say is a lot of what I'm thinking about right now is trying to recognize those stories I have, I do have some control over, or an ability to manipulate, and which stories I don't have an ability to manipulate, and then allow that to be how I then go back to those notions of which details are important, which what, like, is there a latent moment Gnostic connection in this? Is there not? Like it's sort of a constant evaluation process, and then a revising process as I relate to those, how I can affect my own narrative.
Park, you had an observation / question in the chat. Do you want to share it now, or?
Sure. Yeah, I was remembering Wittgenstein's quote, which I put in there: "What can be said at all can be said clearly, and what we cannot talk about, we must pass over in silence." And then I appreciated His Eminence's observation that silence is the language of God. But then also, I think art is all about, but we can't remain silent, right? We keep wanting to find a way to express the ineffable. And so I just was curious your observations about that.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of gets down to again, why I'm here, like why I did that, like that moment that happened to me directing a play in high school that leads me to be sitting in front of all of you now, on the basis of some rolls of Dungeons and Dragons dice, is exactly that thing. Like the Christopher Durang didn't write The Actor's Nightmare so that I could have a Gnostic experience, but But when he wrote that play, and then I discovered it and thought it was interesting and funny and decided to stage it in my final year of high school, the process of just exploring those different moments in that story created a moment of connection that was more sublime and a deeper connection than if I were to write an essay about exactly what that moment was trying to say. It's kind of like that, they say like a picture is worth 1,000 words. I would say like a poignant moment in any kind of narrative art form, or not even a narrative art form, but just in any art, a poignant moment that transfixes you and connects you is worth not just 1,000 words, but is worth an entire novel. It's an exegesis in a second is what is kind of happening.
And maybe in a way, all art that follows that's influenced by that moment is a further elaboration of that moment.
Exactly. Yes. Constant connection and conversation with texts.
Any final thoughts or questions? Okay. Yeah.
I do actually want to just point out Wayne Smith's quote that he wrote, or his playful misquote of Shakespeare, just because I think it's fun. Some are born with narrative, some achieve a new narrative, and some have narratives thrust upon them. And I think that's just generally true. That's a useful way to look at how I'm talking about how all these texts play off each other. So yeah, there we go. That's it for me.
I was going to add in talking about silence and Park's quote. It got me thinking. It was something I think that was either sparked by Monsignor Bray's talk or Monsignor Scott's talk that slipped my brain until now. It's that whole idea of nature abhors a vacuum, and kind of the and as someone who has taught meditation and of course has undergone meditation, the natural tendency of people to be uncomfortable with kind of sitting with their own thinking, or uncomfortable in their own thoughts, that kind of restlessness. So I think there's almost a physiological compulsion to try and describe and try and talk about our experience, even if all we can do is circle endlessly around it, trying to get a 360 view. But yeah, it was the nature abhors a vacuum thing that popped into my head in dealing with silence and language. But I think that thing, that exercise of continually talking it out, even on paper, as Monsignor Scott referred to with Philip K. Dick, is a worthwhile process. God knows, I know that firsthand, as I never shut up. So.
Yeah, okay. Looks like we're good. Then thank you, Jason, for this wonderful talk. Wait. Yes. Journey to become comfortable with being uncomfortable. Yeah, that's right, Brad.
I was going to say, Christian brought it back around and mentioned spiritual direction and talking about, I'm surprised how many of these talks are just kind of blending together. Yeah. I feel sorry for the people who will get them out of order.
Well, they'll get the whole thing eventually. All right. Well, thank you everybody for coming. The next one will be in approximately what?
2 hours, 15 minutes.
Yeah, okay. All right. So we'll see everybody back here for Dr. Glenn Farron.